What's up, everybody? This is Charlie Potter, senior team writer with BamaOnLine.com, joined as always by Jimmy Stein and Blake Byler. And guys, I don't know about you, but I feel like I'm just now starting to come off the, for lack of a better word, hangover that was Saturday in Tuscaloosa. Late night. I'll say this before I turn it over to you guys. I think I walked out of the stadium a little after 2 a.m. Full disclosure, my wife's a nurse, so she drives up to Birmingham. We live in Tuscaloosa, and I saw her wake up to go to work that morning. But she did. All full disclosure too. She did go to bed before the game ended, so I had to fill in on what happened, and then I think I was out and snoring and drooling by the time that she left. So, what about you, Jimmy? How are you recovering from the weekend that was?
One thing, under Saban, famously, there's a 24-hour rule. I think that Kalen DeBoer has adopted this week. That had to be out the window. It certainly was with me. I wasn't done and ready to move on to Vanderbilt until basically Wednesday of this week. I mean, there's just so much to rehash and relive. It's definitely been a fun rewatch for sure. And all the highlights, and Alabama put out that incredible 11-minute video that I've watched a couple times. Boy, what a fun week! But it was an extremely late night. Now I'm not going to talk about how late my night was because it pales in comparison to Mr. Nocturnal over there. I think I went to bed shortly after 1. But keep in mind, I am 100 years old.
That's fair. You're also not the one in the comments that people talk about getting some espresso. That's always me. So I feel that. Blake, I'll say this: Blake didn't leave too much earlier than I did. But how are you recovering from such a wild game, Blake?
Night games can be hard when it comes to our job because they run so late, and then you have a big game, and naturally that's going to have more commercials and a longer drawn out intro and everything. And so I think I left around 1:30. So a little bit before you, but still kind of like Jimmy said, it's been hard for us as covering the team and also as consumers of the sport to kind of flip the switch to Vanderbilt this week because of how big the magnitude of this game was. Also because whenever you look back at the game, so much happened. It wasn't just like a simple beat by beat, like normally played out game. Like this was a very strange game in terms of game script, in terms of just kind of the flow and the way that everything went, very abnormal. So there's a lot to kind of revisit, a lot of things that happened that were strange, that stood out. But it was an awesome game. I mean, when it comes to what you want out of a college football game, it doesn't get much better than that, especially in the regular season in a game that doesn't necessarily have like playoff implications. Like whenever you're not talking about a win or go home game, I think that's as good as it gets. What we saw on Saturday, and it was really cool to be there and witness.
Yeah, I mean, the environment was insane. The atmosphere. Alabama fans, I think I said this on Tuesday's show with Tim and everybody, that they might be a little jaded when it comes to Alabama's success, but they really showed up and showed out on Saturday. And that's we're going to kind of put a bow on this game here with this point, but I wanted to turn it over to you guys. This is the best home game since when, in your opinion, Jimmy?
Gosh, I've given this thought for a few hours since you thankfully gave us a heads up. That's coming because off the top of my head, I would have sat here with like 6 minutes of radio silence trying to come up because it's very difficult. It's very difficult to come up with something close. And I know I'm not going to start listing them out because, everyone's going to have a different answer. But I settled on 05 Florida because I feel to match this game, there needed to be a big win over a great team that really was a proclamation of sorts by Alabama, because this was a major statement. This was Alabama making a statement that Saban's gone, but nothing has changed. When the whole world expected Alabama to go off a cliff when Nick Saban retired, this was Alabama's statement that nothing has changed but the guy that's wearing the whistle. 05, Alabama's win over Florida was followed by a Sports Illustrated cover that exclaimed, "Bama is back," because of that win. Unexpected win. You got to remember, Florida won the national championship shortly, in just, short order. I mean, that was an elite Florida team. And then there's there's Brody Croyle and Tyron Prothro who got injured in that game. But I think Florida 05 is what comes closest. But in all honesty, in my lifetime of going to Alabama games, I think it was the best game / biggest win.
I've seen that a lot. It was just people that, not just, everybody kind of living off the high, but people that go to Alabama games consistently have said that. And it's tough to argue. I know, Blake, you're not as seasoned as Jimmy and I, but what would you say just in the games that you've attended at Bryant-Denny?
Well, it's tough because a lot of times when you think about some of the best games, like the best football games that Alabama's been involved in and the best endings, a lot of time Alabama's on the losing end of it. You think about like the comeback in 2010, or even talking about non-home games. You got the kick six, or you have the Texas game, which was a good game last season, or really there have been a lot of good, the LSU game in 2019. There have been a lot of like good football games that Alabama's been involved in. But because a lot of times that we got accustomed to under Nick Saban, the way Alabama would win big games is they would win dominantly. And so it wouldn't be a thrilling end of the game situation. So I think in terms of scope and scale, this game was probably the biggest in my memory since the 2015 LSU game at home, which is when we're comparing home games. I think I've talked about that on one episode of this before, but that was a big kind of announcement, kind of like Jimmy was talking about, because Alabama's dynasty had been declared dead earlier in that season with their loss to Ole Miss being 2 years removed already from the 2012 national championship. And so they had won continually, starting with a road win at Georgia, and it all kind of built up to a top 4 matchup, 2 versus 4, actually. The same thing rankings wise that we saw on Saturday. It was but in that game, it was number 2 LSU and number 4 Alabama. And Alabama went out and kind of dominated the game. They won the game by 14, and that was the game. Derrick Henry had 230 whatever yards, and Leonard Fournette had 30 on his own, and it kind of swapped who was in first for the Heisman Trophy. Definitely not as entertaining of a game, and definitely not as dramatic of an ending as what we saw on Saturday. But in terms of scope and scale, being a home game that Alabama came out on top in, I think that's the most recent one of that size that came to my mind.
That's a good answer.
Yeah, I think it is too. And I mean, it's not, like you said, there's a lot of those big home games that end in losses. I think this game, just the feel, not what happened on the field, but just the feel and like the buildup, it reminded me of 2011, the game of the century. It just, the amount of people that were there, both notable and not. You have the bye week leading up to it. Just, we felt like we were talking about this game for 2 months, really. So that's what it reminded me of. I think the 2019 LSU game is another one, again, that ended in an Alabama loss, but just all of the distractions, I guess you could say, around it. But those games inside the stadium, they just felt different. And again, I mean, Kalen DeBoer talked about it after the game. He talked about it on Monday. Alabama fans brought it, and it was a big one, especially for Alabama to come out on the winning end. But he's talked about it. The coordinators have talked about it. The players have talked about it. It wasn't a perfect game. Alabama roared out to just an amazing first half, like unbelievable. And then the second half, there's a lot to clean up, and that's kind of what we want to talk about now. Is just the biggest area of improvement for this team. You have the month of September behind you now. You've learned quite a bit about this team, but now you're really into the meat of your SEC schedule before your next bye week. So, Jimmy, I'll turn it over to you first. Just when you're looking at this team coming off this Georgia game, and more specifically about maybe what happened in the fourth quarter, but it could be overall just from the first 4 games we've seen. What do you think is the biggest area improvement for Alabama right now?
Yeah, really, it's my answer is more overall, but it definitely was something that affected the Georgia game. And I considered 2 or 3 things, but what I'm coming down to is production from the running back spot. Now, some of that's misleading, I think, because so much of the production we thought that we'd get almost weekly from Jam Miller and Justice Haynes, whether separately or combined, are because on so many of these RPOs, Jalen Milroe's keeping the ball. He's got the option to keep it or pitch it like a true option type play, and he's kept it a lot. And he's probably making the right decision. I don't know how the coaches are grading that, but it seems like Jalen's usually making the right decision because he's been awfully productive with those keepers. But I think for Alabama to become the offense that they would like to be and becoming near impossible to defend, there needs to be more production from the true running back spot, whether that's just straight runs, less RPO, and more just between the tackles runs, off tackle runs. But I want to see Jam Miller and Justice Haynes start accumulating some yards and making defenses defend them as well. Because if Jalen is responsible for 85% of the offense, like he was against Georgia, he becomes a little easier to defend as teams see more and more film of that. So to me, number one on the priority list for improvement is increased production from the running back position.
Yeah, you got to keep them honest because we've seen the passing game really flourish this season, especially in this last game. And Jalen is a runner. I think if you had told me before the game what his numbers would be, I don't know if I would have believed you just because of Georgia's defense. But I would also think that they would probably just have an overall successful night on the ground from everybody, and that necessarily wasn't the case. And so that's something I'm going to touch on a little later. So I'll save a little bit of my thoughts there. But I think it's a good point. I think a lot of people are kind of curious about the running back position right now. So I think that's a good point. So, Blake, what do you have in terms of just the biggest area of improvement for this Alabama team?
Yeah, it's probably kind of obvious, but I got to go with defense on fourth down and just getting off the field. And we've heard the coaches kind of address it a little bit this week. But when you look at the fourth quarter against Georgia and the comeback that they had, you can almost attribute it entirely. Obviously, there are a lot of factors, but you can almost attribute it entirely to Alabama not being able to get off the field on fourth down. And obviously, things were different and the flow of the game was different in the second half because when you go into halftime with a 30-7 lead and then into the third quarter you have a 33-15 lead, the other team's going to do things that they wouldn't normally do. And so that led to Georgia essentially having 100 yards of four-down territory, which for a defense, that's really hard to defend. You had Georgia, I think one time they went for it on fourth down on their own 29-yard line, like something that would never happen in the course of a normal game. And the statistical probability of Georgia going 5 for 5 or with penalties, I think it was 7 for 7 on fourth down is very low, but it's still, you have to execute no matter what the odds are. You have to get the team off the field. And even outside of the Georgia game, I remember Wisconsin had some success as well on fourth down. I don't know what the exact percentage is of Alabama's fourth down defense on the year, but it's not good. It's towards the bottom nationally, and I believe that they've given up more fourth down conversions than they have stops on the season, which is not good for any defense. And this defense has generally been good, and this defense has also been really good on third down, which is also really important. Knowing that they held Georgia to 3 for 15 on third down is really strong. And in a lot of situations, you're forcing a lot of punts and getting the ball back to your offense a lot. But when you have teams that maybe are a little more aggressive or teams in the future that are going to see these stats and see, hey, if we are a lesser team and we want to stay in the game against Alabama and we need to go for it on fourth down in the first quarter, or we need to go for it on fourth down near midfield, even if we're on our own side of the field, teams have had success doing that. That could cause some problems, especially if they don't tighten up in those situations. So it hasn't obviously been detrimental yet. It was almost detrimental on Saturday night, but they were able to get the stop with the interception at the end of the game and win. But going forward, if you face some aggressive teams, I mean, thank goodness Lane Kiffin's not on the schedule. And thank goodness Lane Kiffin's not on the schedule next week. Like if Alabama was playing Ole Miss, I think Lane Kiffin might go for it on fourth down every single time based on what they've seen so far this year. So that's got to get tightened up. And just based on statistical probability, like the percentage will go down, but you still have to execute. And so that's the biggest thing for me, I think.
Yeah, it's not just Georgia. I mean, Alabama's defense has allowed 10 first downs on 14 attempts. I think they're tied for 115th nationally. On the flip side of that, they've been really good on third down. They're number 2 in the country. And so you just got to get off the field. And like you said, Kane Womack talked about it, and I thought he made some good points in his opening statement on Monday, just how different and challenging that is for a defense whenever you're ahead but that other teams in the whole, they change a lot just from an approach standpoint. And I think that's a good point. It was on my list of things because that's, again, it's scary. I wrote down some numbers, did some math, but hopefully it's correct. For me, though, like it's staying on the defensive side of the ball. I think it's just big plays. We saw it in the South Florida game. They're just explosive runs. You got to limit those. I thought Alabama has done a better job at that since then. But then we saw the explosive plays to the passing game in the second half. I think Georgia had 10 plays of 15-plus yards in this game. 9 of them were more than 20 yards. And 6 of those came in the second half, including that touchdown pass late to go ahead. So I think the secondary overall has played really well this season. Just look at what Xavier Brown was able to do in a big moment late. But before this game, they've done a better job of keeping things in front of them. And give Georgia credit. They've got elite athletes too. They've got guys that can make plays. But you want to clean that up when you've got teams like, no offense to Vanderbilt, when you've got Tennessee on the horizon, heck, even Missouri, some of the playmakers they have on offense. You want to be able to clean that up going into the month of October. So for me, that's where it stands. And again, great segue here. We're going to talk about the Vanderbilt game because it's, in the words of Admiral Akbar, it's a trap. Yeah, at least that's what Alabama's kind of putting out there. We've seen some mousetraps around the facility. Our boy Josh Chapman's been thrown around the floor. That's something we saw Nick Saban do last year before the road trip to Kentucky. So it's not new. It's new to some of these guys, some of the transfers and freshmen. But the message is clear that you can't sleep on this Vanderbilt team. They're 2-2. They could be 4-0, but I mean they do have a loss to Georgia State. But I wanted to pass it on to you guys. Just this, in your opinion. If you get out of, or say you're at halftime in Nashville on Saturday, and this is a close game, Jimmy, I'll start with you. What do you think the reason for that would be? If this Vanderbilt's close, is because of what?
Oh, it would be a few things. I think some years Vanderbilt has been so bad that it wouldn't matter if there's a letdown, but I'll just start giving Vanderbilt credit. This isn't a terrible Vanderbilt team at all. I think they're fairly good. I think if Alabama has a letdown, which would be the reason, hey, what goes up must come down. And Alabama is sky high right now. It's got to fall back to earth to some extent. Vandy is probably good enough to take some level of advantage there because this isn't the terrible Vandy teams of the past. They're really good at quarter. They got a quarterback now. Most years they don't. They do now. And I watched Vandy against Virginia Tech. I watched them against Missouri. I think they're better at the line of scrimmage than they normally are. Are they great? Are they Georgia, Tennessee? Of course not. I'm just saying they're better than Vanderbilt normally is at the line of scrimmage. And they have their best quarterback in a while. He doesn't do anything super special, but he's just kind of a winner. And there's a toughness to him, kind of a get it done no matter what. So if it's close, it's because Alabama had a letdown and Vanderbilt finally has a team good enough to maybe take advantage if Alabama shows up with their C game.
I'm disappointed that you didn't watch the Alcorn State and Georgia State game, Jimmy. I'll be honest with you. It's Yeah, talk about a letdown.
I watched Alabama, Georgia for the 4th time.
I'm just kidding. But it is a team I think is improved. I think that comes across whenever you hear from the Alabama coaches because I think most of them are very genuine and straight up with what they have to say. And it didn't take long for them to really praise Clark Lee and that defensive staff for what they've been able to do in Nashville. So yeah, I think it's not your typical Vanderbilt team. Alabama's favored by 23 points at last check, I believe. But like you said, coming off a huge win, this is the perfect time for a letdown. I think we'll learn a lot about the maturity of this team. And I'll turn it over to you, Blake. When we're in the press box, in front of less than 30,000 people on Saturday. If we look at each other at halftime and, have a skeptical look on our faces because of what, in your opinion?
I think it would have to be a combination of things, obviously. I think one would be turnovers because if Alabama's giving the ball away, giving Vanderbilt short fields, that's always a recipe for an upset. That's a little hard to see because Alabama's actually done really well taking care of the ball for the most part this season, outside of a couple interesting fumbles that seemed kind of random against South Florida. Like Jalen Milroe just threw his first interception of the season against Georgia, and it wasn't even a bad decision. It was a decent throw that C.J. Dupree got his hands on, tipped up into the hands of a defender. So Milroe was taking care of the ball really well, and we know last year that wasn't always the case, especially if you go back to games like Texas where he threw 2 picks like straight to the defense. So I think for whatever reason, you would have to probably see a couple interceptions or a couple guys put the ball on the deck and Vanderbilt recover. And then on top of that, I think Vanderbilt offensively would, like you talked about with the big plays, Diego Pavia, their quarterback, would have to probably get loose for a couple long runs. He's a dual threat and a really tough player, like Jimmy was saying. We were talking today to safeties coach Colin Hitchler, and he pointed out that Pavia was a state championship winning wrestler in high school, and he played at New Mexico State last year, was the quarterback that went on the road with that team and beat Auburn. So he has experience beating an SEC defense, and he's a guy that likes to run the ball. And we've seen Alabama struggle this season with South Florida a couple weeks ago when Byron Brown, a really explosive runner, had some success being able to kind of get away from Alabama's defensive line and move the ball and move the chains that way with the quarterback run, a lot of times scrambling. So it would have to be a combination of Pavia racking up a bunch of rushing yards and breaking contain and being able to kind of cause problems for Alabama's defense that way, on top of some turnovers. But going into the game, the turnovers thing doesn't really worry me based on how they've taken care of the ball decently well so far this season. But as far as a recipe for an upset goes, that would have to be part of it.
Yeah, you look at it through 4 games, Alabama's +3 in turnover margin. I believe the Georgia game actually did wonders for that because they were, kind of flatlined at 0 after the South Florida game. So they have taken care of the ball. But yeah, if you're on the road, it's not going to be a hostile environment. It's a small crowd. It's going to be a lot of crimson there. But in another circumstance, that might be an issue. We'll see. I do think that Vanderbilt, though, look at them. I write it down. They're 5th in the SEC in scoring offense with 37 points per game. That's pretty impressive, given that they've faced an ACC team. They've had a game in SEC play, but defensively they're 14th with 23.3 points per game, and Alabama hasn't scored under 40 so far this season. So that number's probably going to go up after this weekend. But Jimmy, we'll kind of put a bow on Vanderbilt here. Just what are your overall thoughts on the Commodores? Because we've talked a lot about Diego Pavia, and he is an impressive player. But overall, whenever you've seen those couple games from Vanderbilt, what stands out to you?
Yeah, better at the line of scrimmage, more athletic. They look like an SEC team. I mean, most of the years you watch Vanderbilt play, they don't match up physically with the rest of the league, to say nothing of the elite teams in the league like Alabama and Georgia and Texas. And I'm not saying Vanderbilt matches up with those teams, but I think Vanderbilt sort of looks like a mid to lower tier SEC football team. Up front, they're big, they're pretty athletic. And, Clark Lee's a good defensive mind. I think they might not have highly recruited kids, but I think they've got kids he wants to play in his system. He seems more comfortable than he's been. But to be honest, I mean, in terms of how did Vanderbilt go from being that bad to being pretty competitive, it's the quarterback. I mean, they finally have a quarterback. I mean, it's 2024. And my advice to anyone out there that wants to improve their program significantly in 1 year, go get a quarterback. If Diego Pavia was at Auburn, I don't want to give them any compliment here at all, but this is just my honest opinion after watching him play at Auburn. If Diego Pavia was at Auburn, they're 5-0 right now.
Certainly.
Bold statement for sure. I thought about making a comment, but I'll hold off. With that, we'll get out of here on this. We've seen 4 games. Alabama's been through the first month of the season. We've seen a lot of guys contribute and contribute in a big way. Obviously, Jalen Milroe, if he's not on people's list for the Heisman, at least for the top 3, I don't know what they're doing. Ryan Williams has been unbelievable. There's been a lot of guys on the defensive side of the ball that have played really well. But going into October now with the calendar turning, who's a player that you think could have a big month now that maybe was more so on the quiet or more underrated side in September? Blake, I'll start with you.
That's a good question. Statistically, because I think he's played really well, and I think he's gotten some praise for it, but I'm going to go with Malachi Moore, who I think has been really good so far this season as far as positioning, as far as making plays. He's just all over the field. He's everywhere. I mean, we looked at each other on Saturday night and we were like, I don't know how he doesn't have a turnover or a takeaway yet, because he's all over the field and it seems like he's making a play on every ball that gets thrown. And I feel like that's been pretty consistent throughout the season. He had a couple of almost takeaways against Wisconsin, and he had a couple of almost takeaways against Georgia, and he's just been really solid. And I think once he gets that first one, you might see a few more come after. It just feels like it's a matter of time before he makes an impact in that specific way. He did have the forced fumble against Wisconsin, but I'm talking about an interception with him from the safety spot. So I think he has been really good, but hasn't necessarily been a guy who has had stats or interceptions that have popped out on the stat sheet. But I think that could change here in the future. And I think he's been one of the most consistent pieces of this defense. And he's been a great leader. And you can see visually how vocal he is during games, which is a huge part for this defense. He's obviously a captain. He's a leader of this team. And I think he is in store for a huge rest of the year. And that starts in October.
Yeah, Malachi is definitely a guy that doesn't take crap from anybody, and he wants everybody to bring their A game. He certainly brought it the first month of the season. I think it's a good pick, though. Like he was kind of on my list. I kind of scratched him out, just trying to, you write down so many, you got to only have a handful, especially when you go last. But I think Malachi, he's assisted on some plays, like the forced fumble you were talking about at Wisconsin. Hell of a play, yeah. But somebody else gets their hands on the ball. He's, I think, second on the team in pass breakups with 4. It just feels like it's only a matter of time before he pulls one in, and hell, he might even take it to the house. We've seen that a ton from Malachi in his career. So I like that pick. What about you, Jimmy?
I like the Malachi pick a lot. That's someone that I strongly considered, and a couple other guys. I won't go through the list because that screws up Charlie at the end.
Hey, I've got multiple, man. I'm ready to roll.
I know. I'll pick this one, and I hate using. I'm not sure underrated's the right term for him. I'll just say he's not technically a starter, but I think a kid that's going to have a huge October is LT Overton, just simply because we've seen a lot of flashes. We've seen some plays. Now he's got 4 games under his belt at his new position. I think in the month of October, in this stretch, particularly Vanderbilt, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Missouri, I think LT Overton becomes a thing nationally. I'm sure, Joe Football in Oregon won't end this month knowing who he is. I'm not saying that. But I think the Dane Bruglers, the Matt Millers, people that are on Twitter and follow the draft know I'm talking about. I think LT Overton becomes an increasing thing with NFL evaluators. Like, hey, I don't know if y'all have noticed, but this Alabama kid, Overton, he ain't getting beat much. I think he kind of explodes in October NFL stock-wise.
Yeah, I like that pick too. He's another one that I considered, and LP had a big game against Wisconsin. He's had some big moments, but I think it feels like he's right on the cusp of really, really breaking out. And I think there's potential for that. And I agree. I think he could be someone that's a one and done. I'm actually shocked. The guys that I wrote down that I had like my top 3, y'all didn't pick. That usually never happens. But I mean, Jimmy, you touched on it at the top. I think Justice Haynes, he has to be like the first pick for me. You look at him through 4 games, he has 25 carries. I think that would have surprised us maybe a month and a half ago. Just look at that number: 25 carries, 200 yards, 2 touchdowns. He's a guy that he started every game. I think he's made an impact. He's actually been really productive as a receiver. He has 6 catches, which I believe is tied for 4th on the team. Hasn't done a ton with it, as much as maybe like a Jam Miller, like on the wheel route we saw in the Georgia game. But I think Justice is a guy that he's going to continue to be a big part of the offense. I think they're going to lean on the running game at times a little more than maybe we've seen early on. And I just think he's due. I think he would probably have liked to have had a little bit more carries against his home state Bulldogs. But, with the meat of the SEC schedule here, you got to have, guys ready to go and to carry the rock. And I think for Alabama too, we talked about those 4th down issues. I think guys like Jam and Justice, they want to be able to finish and be able to kind of take the air of the ball late. And that really wasn't the case at the end of the Georgia game. So I think they're not going to be needing much motivation here in the month of October. So I think That's a guy that I can see a big month for. And I'll share my defensive pick. I think Devontae Smith is someone who had a hell of a game against Georgia, but was just dealing with cramps. He tried to go back in, cramped up again. He leads this team with 5 pass breakups. He is a enforcer on that defensive side of the ball. He likes to yap a little bit, but I think you need that at that Husky position. So I think Smitty's a guy that he could be due to get his hands on the ball a couple times too. So I like those guys that have big Octobers. We could have really done the whole show doing this because there's guys that are on the cusp that feels like of doing it. Kendrick Law is a popular pick that I thought one of y'all would say. I just think there's so many guys that are contributing, but have room to contribute more. And I think we'll see that moving forward. But guys, appreciate it. Hopefully, we're feeling fresh. We're feeling rejuvenated after a long weekend. But I hope everybody's enjoyed the coverage. We're starting to shift our focus toward Vanderbilt. Like Jimmy said, there's just so much to talk about after that Georgia game. Hope you guys stay tuned to BamaOnLine, the roundtable, the message board choice for Alabama fans, and you'll stay locked in here on YouTube. I know we'll have a post-game show on Saturday. Blake and I will be in Nashville, so it'll be up to everybody else to recap the game. But like and subscribe if you haven't already, and tune in because we'll keep you in tune on all things Alabama. And until next time, thanks everybody.